Hi everybody, welcome. It's great to see you in person and to people online as well. Just wanted to take the opportunity while I was here to thank Craig for all of the work he's done both today but over the last few years as well, and also Joy and my team who works really closely with Craig getting everything sorted for the SGA. So thanks, just really taking the opportunity to sort of say that. So yeah, Rob and I are here to sort of give a bit of a recap probably of where we are over the last year and share a bit of wider context for Sport England and UK sport. My role as strategic lead at Sport England is really to manage all the work we do from an external governance point of view. So the good governance catalyst that Jeanette spoke about in Uniting the Movement, that sort of sits with me, and the Code for Sports Governance is a real anchor for all of our work in that respect, but we do lots of things around that as well. And Rob, I'm sure will come on to explain his role at UK Sport as well. So yeah, just to give you a bit of a recap where we are, the wider context, and hopefully just touch on a few of the areas that are going to be looked at in more depth throughout the day as well. So this just sort of goes back a bit to when we started the code, and I've put the 2 dates up there just to sort of remind us all how long the Code for Sports Governance has been in place. So it launched in 2016 and so has now been in place for my maths 6 years, and we decided that we were going to review it about 4 years of it being in place, so quite a good period of time for experience of implementing it, for seeing actually how it worked in practice. And over that time, the code's been applied to about 4,000 organisations, so a really wide group of organisations, many of those at that lower tier 1 level of the code, but about 300 or so at the full code level. So lots of learnings over that time. And it also shows the wider impact that the code's had. So tier 3, the full code often gets loads of focus, but there's loads of touch points at that lower sort of small grassroots community level as well with the tier 1. So in doing the code review, we looked at all aspects of the code, but we're clear that our particular focus was on improving diversity and inclusion. It was really key, and Jeanette's talked about some of that when she was speaking earlier. And we also wanted to make sure that the review was informed by evidence and research. So we conducted an independent consultation in 2020, and I've just jotted a few things there that it told us. So the good thing is, nearly 90% of people had, during that sort of 4-year period, found the code helpful. Good, we can carry on sort of using it and implementing it. Some of the areas that people spoke about in terms of the impact, where it had had a positive impact in terms of governance, were improved board diversity, having the introduction of term length, so refreshing sort of those who sat around the board were helping to make decisions. And then just a general overall tightening of governance within their organisations. You'd hope that would have been one of the impacts, right? So that was good to see. And then in terms of areas people wanted to see improvement, there was a bit about accessibility. So the full code's quite a dense document. So for those tier 1 organisations that we're talking about, for example, that's, could be quite scary or quite a lot to look at when they don't need to apply all of that. So we've introduced a new booklet for tier 1 organisations, which is solely focused on them and provides a lot of resource and support at that level. And then just also applying the code proportionately. It is a mandatory code for organisations that seek investment from us, so it's important that we're able to apply it in a way that makes sense for the investment and for the organisation that we're working with. And then the other sort of thing that came out of the code review was a number of new areas that respondents to that consultation and the research and evidence we did propose for inclusion. And I'll sort of come on to those now. I'm not going to go into them in loads of detail because the rest of the sessions throughout the day will pick up on those. But just listed at the top here are the sort of the main new areas in the code. There are other adjustments and updates to other areas, but these are the sort of the big ticket bits, if you like. This is where you'll see new requirements in the code or substantive changes. And as I said, I'm not going to go into each of those in detail because people will today talk through those. but probably just to focus again on the importance of equality, diversity and inclusion. You'll see there are 3 new requirements in the code around that, but it's also interspersed. Diversity is interspersed throughout the code. So when I did a recent word search, I hadn't done it actually before, for the word diversity, it's mentioned 99 times in the revised code. So you'll see it in other requirements, whether it's talking about skills around the board or other different areas. And then I mentioned Tier 1. So we had a particular sort of work stream that looked at Tier 1, and that made some changes to how those requirements at that lower level of the code, the sort of minimum requirements of the code, I don't really want to call it the lower level, but just the minimum requirements of the code, to make them easier to understand for organisations that we fund, that we don't fund, that want to access that and want to be able to use that. And that separate booklet, as I said, includes sort of various different links to support guidance and is solely focused at those smaller community groups. The other sort of change we made around Tier 1 was that organisations, previously the code had applied to any organisation that received investment from Sport England and UK Sport. But we realised that actually for some of the investments, particularly for Sport England, at a really low level, it can be matters of hundreds of pounds. So the code now applies to organisations receiving over £10,000 or over. It doesn't mean that there aren't sort of due diligence checks happening below that level, but it means that the code doesn't have to be applied directly to those. Many organisations within the sector do want to use it though, so it can work, and it does work for smaller organisations. So I think I'm handing over to Rob now, and then I'll be back in a moment. Thank you.
Thank you, Lindsay, and good morning, everyone. My name is Rob Marini. I'm Head of Sporting System at UK Sport. Part of my role is to work with national governing bodies on what we call organisational health, which I'll touch on a little bit later. But organisational health includes governance and equality, diversity and inclusion. So it's a real pleasure to be here with you today. Briefly, what I'll touch on is our approach both between Sport England and UK Sport with regards to governance and the use of the code. Clearly, the governance code sets the standard for governance in funded organisations as well as UK Sport and Sport England. And I think sort of, what's really important to remember, partly as Lindsay mentioned, the first 4 to 5 years of implementing the code is really ensuring that organisations could meet the requirements set out in the code. And particularly in the first phase, when the code came out in 2016, there was an enormous amount of work that organisations had to conduct in order to meet the requirements in the code. And that was for many, quite a stressful, quite a difficult time. But it was great to be able to achieve that element of compliance and then maintaining that level of standard. That's where we are now. It's about maintaining those requirements and those compliance levels. But a little bit echoing what Jeanette was saying, I think where we're looking to move on to now is really embedding the code within the structures of an organisation, as well as across the sector, and actually slightly changing the discourse from compliance to actually one of culture. But in order to get there, we also recognise there's a lot of support that needs to be provided. So I'll touch on that a little bit later. And as I said, the type of approach that we want to be able to drive with yourselves and other organisations, one very much embedded in partnership. For now, sort of in terms of those new requirements that Lindsay outlined, we've set out recently for Tier 3 funded organisations that in terms of meeting those requirements, there's a deadline of the end of April, after which we will be reviewing the information that organisations will have submitted by then, and then sort of, come up with any actions, any gaps that might need to be addressed. What I want to stress, and I really hope that this is the case, is that what we're doing is not to be prescriptive about sort of, the type of information that we're asking for each of those new requirements. We know for the vast majority of organisations, those new requirements are already embedded, are already part of how an organisation functions. And so what we want to do is have the opportunity to look at what organizations already have and then be able to use that process to identify any gaps that hopefully is there, not just about meeting compliance, but hopefully strengthening the organizations. And of course, the code is there, it's not just about the new requirements, remains something that organizations are asked to maintain compliance on. So that is something that we want to make sure that is kind of factored in across the board. But as Lindsay mentioned, ED&I is a really key focus, and what we expect to see is to see some meaningful progress over the next couple of years, particularly with support that we are planning to put in place, hopefully from the early part of next year. And you'll hear a little bit more on that from my colleague Trixie and also Lindsay at Sport England. Oh, sorry, just before we move on to this, what I wanted to touch on is the fact that, look, the code remains a funding condition for organizations. And I think when you think about the amount of funding that, that this involves, a minimum of £1 million for Tier 3 funded organizations, those are substantial amounts of funding. And that's irrespective of the size, capacity of any organization in receipt of that money. And that in itself presents, for many, a real big challenge. But the principle itself remains an important one because it's public money, and we have responsibility to make sure that the governance around that public money is right, is appropriate, and all the systems and structures are in place to make sure that that is safeguarded. But let's make no mistake, I want to move on from this being a funding condition. This is about actually sort of, providing a framework for good governance. Again, echoing a little bit to what Jeanette was saying, is about sort of, ensuring that there is a set of standards that we can all sort of, use and improve and sort of, enhance in order to make sure that not just the governance structures within our organizations are right, but actually our organizations become more resilient and more fit for purpose and are able to manage the issues that inevitably, day in, day out, we have to deal with. And so for many, I know for many organizations, this is not just about compliance, it's really using the code in this way. And I think that's exactly where we want to move on to and operate. But, as I said, the amount of funding doesn't go alongside size and capacity for many organizations. And that is a real challenge. And this is where the support comes in. We're spending quite a bit of focus between UK Sport and Sport England to really identify the type of bespoke support, guidance and advice that our teams, whether it's the governance functions or sort of, other colleagues across our organization, that can provide directly to the organizations to which the code applies to. It's also about ensuring that we can offer external independent support for elements of the code where actually that expertise may not necessarily lie within UK Sport or Sport England, but actually we require additional insights. So I mentioned that briefly about the diversity and inclusion work, but also making sure that around cascading good governance, there are pilot projects where we can see and test how this can be done, particularly at regional level. And there's some projects that Sport England particularly has spearheaded in relation to Perret Leva and ED&I at that regional level. And then, of course, the Sports Governance Academy, providing sort of that platform for support and network and exchange in relation not just to the code, but governance more broadly. So briefly, in terms of the ways of working, I'll pass on to Lindsay in a second, but I just wanted to say and recognise that there's an enormous amount of work that goes on between the teams at UK Sport and Sport England that often happens behind the scenes. But we just wanted to take the opportunity to thank the teams because as I said, it's part of the way we want to work between ourselves, but also with yourselves, and making sure that the code is not just a joint instrument that we can promote and use, but actually we're learning together from it. So I just wanted to acknowledge the teams for the work that they're doing. Lindsay, do you want to go?
Thanks, Rob. And yeah, just to echo that support for the work that the teams do together, I think increasingly more over the last year or so, I think there's very few projects that each governance team works on individually now. Most of it is sort of joint work, so it's really important, but it gives us that extra resource and knowledge as well. So just to pick up, put sort of a note there about the evolution of the code, and I think we've heard the sort of phrase compliance to culture already mentioned. I think Jeanette mentioned it already today, and you know, I was reflecting on it. I think if I could get rid of the word compliance, I would, because to me the code, even when we first introduced it, has never really been about that. It is of course, as Rob said, a mandatory funding condition, so that is inevitably part of it. But I hope, you know, in the way that we've worked with you as our partners, that we've not tried to implement it in that way. It's really about what the code offers, the tool that it offers for partners and for us to implement good governance, and in a way that makes sense to you, in a way that you own it. It's not as sort of mandating what needs to happen. We're sort of there as a tool for it to be implemented. So yeah, I think that word of compliance is probably still there for a little bit, but you know, I try and use it less and less. It is much more about how you as organisations are governing and running the way that you do business. And the responses to the consultation when we did the code review also showed that as well. It was really positive to see sort of, firstly, the engagement we had with the independent consultation. I think we had over 200 responses and about 10 focus groups. And that sort of sense of like the importance and the positive impact of the code, so nearly 90% saying it had been helpful, hopefully means that's being lived in practice. But you know, standing here today, I guess I just wanted to say that again about sort of it being much more than just a compliance tool, really. And, you know, the third bullet point really talks about that. So it's really about how we, you know, Sport England and UK Sport are two organisations. Our partners are so many more. So how we work with you and how we learn from you through things like the Sports Governance Academy and through other work that we do to inform what we do with the code, and the platform that we have around good governance is really important. So that sort of header there about partnership working really rings true. You know, we want to work with you, we want to learn from you, as we don't think that we've got all the answers. So I'd say, you know, some of the things that Jeanette spoke about earlier around taking the opportunity today to network, to learn, to listen, I think, and I hope we continue that through things like the hub that the SGA sort of offers. And then lastly, just of course to touch on our work with the home country sports councils, which Jeanette has already done, so I won't speak, and I know we're going to talk about later on one of the sessions as well here. So, but I think since the inception of the code for sports governance, we've had a close working relationship with our colleagues in the home country sports councils. We have some different governance frameworks in place, but the spirit and sense of what we want to do has always been very much aligned. And I think we've had opportunities over the last sort of number of years to come even closer together on those things. And the SGA is a prime example of that. So I mentioned we'd just touched, I think, Rob and I, briefly on some of the wider strategic context for Sport England and UK Sport in relation to good governance. And I probably won't dwell on this too long because Jeanette's already talked about a bit of this in her opening keynote. But many of you will be aware that for Sport England, tackling inequalities is the central mission of our strategy, Uniting the Movement. And some of the things we've been talking about already around equality, diversity and inclusion are really key. You know, that mission of tackling inequalities carries through to our governance work, because if we can improve the diversity of the decision makers within the system, that's got to have an impact in terms of making some changes, so the people that make the decisions and take the actions are more diverse. They're going to understand, and they're going to sort of like hopefully have an impact in terms of tackling inequalities. And then Jeanette talked about good governance being one of the 5 catalysts in Sport England's strategy. And I just looked back at sort of one of the sort of things that's written around that, and I'll just read it briefly. So we say in Uniting the Movement, we want the sector to embrace good governance, moving from compliance with a formal code to a culture, see those words again, compliance to culture, across sporting organisations that embraces good governance and strives to be among the best run in the world. That's the ambition for us all, to be among the best run sporting organisations in the world. This will help build a sector where those taking part do so in a safe and positive environment, whether in the paid workforce, volunteering, or being active. So some of those things in the new code, for example, around people, which I know is going to be talked about later, sort of links to some of those, you know, regardless of where those people are in the system, whether they're employees, whether they're volunteers, or they're the people taking part. And then just from a Sport England perspective, just to sort of touch on the wide range of organisations we work with that informs our work in good governance. So I've mentioned already that scope from Tier 1 to Tier 3. We're working with organisations at all levels of the system, so from those small grassroots community groups to system partners, what we term now system partners, those with long-term substantive investments, so the sort of plus £1 million investments that Rob was talking about. And that also covers for us, and this is outlined in our strategy, that ambition to support partners, so those that we fund, but also the many organisations within the system that don't receive direct investment for us. And things like the Sports Governance Academy are key in that respect. They offer free advice, a hub, a peer-to-peer opportunity, particularly for organisations that don't receive investment as well as those that do. So that, just to sort of set good governance in a bit of context for Sport England, and I'll let Rob do a similar thing for UK Sport.
I promise this is the last bit of the relay. And just briefly from a UK Sport perspective, sort of what we've been trying to do in the last couple of years is recognise that governance doesn't happen in a vacuum, and the code is not applied in a vacuum in itself, but actually it's an integral part of what makes a healthy organisation in a healthy sporting system. So our organisational strategy identifies, in terms of leading high-performance sport, identifies 3 ambitions, one of which is that one there at the top, growing a thriving sporting system. And the work that we do on governance and the use of the code very much underpins a lot of the work in that ambition. What we've also done in the last 6 months or so, developed what we're calling organisational health tool, which is this wheel here. And again, it's trying to unpack what do we mean by a healthy organisation. As I said, governance is an integral core component of that. But alongside that, there's obviously other elements, from the fact of having good leadership, good culture, good organisational strategy, ED&I embedded in everything we do, integrity, financial health and risk management, etc., etc. So these are the component parts that we've identified, and we've developed, as I said, a tool that explains what we think sort of, underpins each of these components. It's available on our website, and it's also sort of in some of the wider resources there. But I just wanted to show you how sort of, we've evolved our thinking in terms of code and governance and applying it within sort of, what we think makes up a really healthy sporting body. My colleague Emma at the end will also touch on this a little bit later. And if you've got any questions on this, please come and talk to us during the breaks. The last bit I wanted to share is that at UK Sport, we're also, we work in high-performance sport. An element of this is major events. So we do quite a lot of work around the governance of major events, and therefore, again, how the code can apply and needs to be adapted to that sort of work. And of course, in relation to performance programs as well. But we've got a very active international program as well. And I know colleagues here in this room and also online, they're driving a lot of this work internationally in terms of enhancing the standards of governance in international sport. And we should not underplay the level of the reputation and the respect that the code has internationally. A number of countries have come and visited us in the last 6 years, wanting to know about the code and how that's been developed, wanting to emulate something similar, and applying it to their own context. And I've been privileged, and Lindsay as well has spoken to this group of organisations as well in the past. I've been privileged to be part of a partnership called the International Partnership Against Corruption in Sport. But one of the things that we've been developing together with international federations and other governments is an overarching governance benchmark for any organisation in the world, whether you're a national federation, an international federation, or sort of, a continental federation, that draws a lot of inspiration from the code. So again, just wanted to share sort of, that perspective, not just from a domestic point of view, but also how this applies internationally as well. So finally, wrapping up, as I said, the code remains a principal tool for us in terms of how we want to drive, but crucially embed and cascade good governance within organizations and across the sector, and drive meaningful reform, particularly in the area of ED&I. We want to be able to shift to an approach that is really focused on partnership, and one that learns and develops, because just Lindsay said, we don't have all the answers, so that's where we want to be in this phase of the code. And also recognise that the code doesn't happen in isolation, and therefore, hopefully, what you've heard from Sport England and UK Sport gives you a sense of how the code and governance applies across all of our strategic work. Thank you very much.
You seem to be running away before any questions. No? No? Is this... if anybody does have any questions, there is a roving mic. Con is waving it around at the back there. There may not be any. You may have covered absolutely everything. Everybody. Oh no, there is one right at the front. Please, as well. I know there's one or two technical glitches on the Wi-Fi. So if the people at home, I hope also you're able to submit your questions via the app or the platform. So please do, and I'll pick them up here. Just before Kevin does go. Just following up on something that Rob was saying about the international angle. This is just anecdotally from my part as well, but in the course of the work that I've been doing over the last couple of years, I've had people from other countries coming to me and saying, we wish we had something in place in our country like you've got over in the UK. So I think it's one thing for the sports councils to have in place a governance code, which is fantastic, and holding people and organisations to account, which is also fantastic. But the support side of that, what they're doing to help people get to terms with the code, implement it, and really get the most out of it, I think is equally important. So I think we're in a fairly privileged position in this country that we've got that situation whereby we've got a great document and we've got the ambition and the drive to support organisations to meet it. So that's just my little 2 pence worth. Kevin, over to you.
Thanks, Craig. Yeah, Kevin Carpenter. My question's about the use of the code in relation to COVID-19. So to what extent was it used as a, let's say, compliance tool in that instance when it came to the COVID-19 loans that were given by Sport England in particular? Because obviously we've then seen organisations get into significant difficulty. If we look at Rugby Union, for example, and I assume some of the organisations that came for loans were not already funded at that time. So I appreciate the time pressure, but I'd just be interested to see if it was used and to what extent. Thanks.
Realised I probably should come over here. So we didn't actually in practice apply the code during the COVID-19 period, in the sense of there weren't probably new investments coming in during that time. It was more sort of managing existing partnerships, so we didn't do a new round of compliance checks or things like that. But there was a separate programme to do with the sports survival package that was related to government loans and things like that, so a slightly different situation. What we did do was sort of adapt our policy for how the code applies during that period to really be pragmatic about basically saying, although there weren't loads of new investments sort of to new partners going out the door, we didn't apply it in the same way, recognising that we just need to be pragmatic and proportionate with it. I think it probably provided some tools at some levels to refer to, but it wasn't really used in a compliance sense, partly because it didn't need to be and partly because we were being pragmatic in terms of any investment that did go out. Hopefully that helps. Thanks, Kevin.
So hopefully, I come at this from 3 perspectives. I am a strong advocate of good governance, and I've carried out research in this. I've written doctoral thesis and research papers, and I'm also a vice chair of a largish local, you class as tier 3. And I think just, first of all, commend you and really recognise the great strides. And I use the Code of Governance. I've recently written a strategic plan for the organisation I'm vice chair of, and I've obviously used the values. A slight frustration that I picked up from speaking to other chairs, vice chairs, and I also work as a consultant, do a bit of work with Active Lancashire and some other organisations, is the frustrations with their governing bodies or their leagues. So I think anything that you can do to we're trying to do our best at the kind of tier 3 voluntary sports level. But obviously pushing it when we see some examples sometimes of inappropriate governance at that higher level. And that causes frustrations and difficulties for us to try and embed or encourage other organisations. So I think the work you're doing is great, but I think that's where sometimes there's a bit of a disconnect, and we feel at our level there's mixed messages from the kind of higher level, not from yourselves, but from the governing body, for example, that we're linked to. So just sort of commend you, but also encourage you to really sort of chase them up a bit sometimes. Because there's a bit of frustration there. Not just myself, but other chairs and vice chairs.
Thank you very much. No, that's really, first of all, thank you for your positive comments, and then good to hear of your experiences. I suppose it kind of echoes where we want to be with the code, whereby it's really understanding it applied to a certain set of organisations when it came out. And I think, to be fair, a lot of the focus has been on the boards and reforms within the boards. And what we're really interested in now is really, of course, to maintain that and maintain those standards at the highest decision-making level, but actually really seeing how the code can apply and cascaded across the organisation and different aspects of a particular sport. And indeed, it's why it's one of the new requirements as well. And it kind of is both about cascading down as well as kind of making sure that then improves accountability and decision-making and transparency up above as well. And I think this is where we want to be able to understand the experiences that the bodies that code applies to. What is that like? Where is it that we are, clearly it's working really well, and where is it that actually it's not? And it's not, again, coming from it from a compliance point of view, but actually because this is really, it's really about ensuring that governance is embedded at all levels of an organisation or a sport, and actually how essential that is, not because the code says so, but if organisations want to survive, want to be able to exist, and ideally want to be able to continue to be resilient and thrive, then that's really, in absolutely the best interests of everyone. So a bit of a generic answer, but I'd be really interested in terms of when we try and implement that requirement, what experiences organisations have at all sorts of levels where the gaps exist. Thank you.
I was just going to say as well, did you mention leagues as well when you were talking? I might have misheard, but yeah, I think, and the other thing I was sort of reflecting on was that the code, if you like, it isn't law in the sense that our remit is we're only able to apply it to the organisations with whom we invest. Although through the cascading good governance requirement, that sort of hope that it's, there's a requirement in that sort of looks to spread that sort of within organisations. But nevertheless, I think we are advocates for it. So we do try from a sort of, policy influencing space where we can, and we'll speak at various different things to try and influence in that sense, but conscious of like the remit we have in terms of the code, but where hopefully, we have some other ambassadors in the room here as well that might speak about it. So opportunities like that. Thanks.
I'll let Lindsay and Rob go in just 1 second, but we do have a question through from a virtual attendee. And that is to say that they are trying to cascade good governance within their organisation to the clubs. And I suppose implicit within the question is whether the removal of the 10,000 funding limit is perhaps in some ways a disincentive in terms of the carrot of possible funding being used in order to improve good governance. And I hope you don't mind me using your name, Beatrice. You are asking what the reasoning was behind removing that small applications from Tier 1.
Yeah, thank you, Beatrice, for the question. So I think, like in spirit, we want everybody to be able to access the code, whatever type of organisation they are. But because it's a mandatory funding condition, it means that it had to be applied regardless of. This is probably particularly keen in a Sport England context, given the range of different investments we're making. But sometimes we're making investments of a couple of £100. It could be, it has in the past been that sort of size. So it was really trying to be pragmatic about the application of the code in that sense. So I talked about thousands of investments being made at that level. So it was being I guess, and responding to some of the feedback we had in the consultation about being proportionate in that application. But it doesn't mean that organisations below that 10,000 level can not apply it themselves, or that it doesn't make sense in that context. It's more probably from a pragmatic investment point of view.
That's fantastic. Thank you for that impromptu Q&A at the end. Just to let you know, there will be Q&A sessions at the end of all presentations, so please do have questions ready, and please do send them through via the platform. Just to answer one other question on the virtual, yes, we can share the presentations, and the recordings, like I said at the start, will be available on the platform and on the SGA website shortly after today's event. So thank you, Rob. Thank you, Lindsay, for kicking us off this morning. If everybody give a round of applause.